Have you noticed people got more religious since COVID?
Yes, absolutely.
I don't have data to show, but I've noticed that totally. Yeah.
It is absolutely true. My idea is in the 2000s, we were working out the level of reason. In the 2010s, we're working out the level of spirit. And that's where you get the I'm spiritual, but not religious. And then in the 2020s, you get people working out religion. That's my idea, is that the 2020s, people are working out religion. And that the 2030s, that's where we're going to need the absolute knowing, which is, again, the importance of holding the contradiction between atheism and Christianity. This course is going to be relevant to like the philosophical types now, but I think in the 2030s, this will be more common thinking.
Interesting. I want to return to what you said about Peterson, because that kind of just made me think of Peterson in a bit of a different light. Because I first saw Jordan Peterson, his popularity as the result of sort of like young male angst.
Yeah.
And like loneliness or just a lack of male role models.
Yeah.
He kind of filled that vacuum, but I think he's filling it actually even bigger vacuum.
Yeah.
Which you point out, and it made me retroactively think of something. So what's interesting, I actually went to a Jordan Peterson lecture in around 2017. It was before he was popping off, but he was before like his whole like protest against the Canadian Ontario government
bill C-16.
Yeah, C-16. Yeah, it was before all that. Like I always disagreed with his politics, but I had some friends who were really into Peterson, and they had tickets, so we went. And I saw 3 high school teachers there that were some of my favorite teachers actually in the public high school that I attended. And one of them was like a very left-wing teacher, and I didn't expect him to be there. And Peterson back then was like not a leftist, but he wasn't like a hard right-winger, like wasn't part of Daily Wire. He's part of Daily Wire now.
I think that's the key historical distinction with Peterson, is before and after Daily Wire, because that's when he like sort of explicitly became like a conservative talk show like host. Basically, he's he just like fully went into like his anti-woke thing.
Fully. Like before I'd view him as a conservative liberal, and then now he's just a neoconservative at this point. But like what was interesting is the reasons the teachers, well, one of them particularly gave for why they like Peterson. And he said, Peterson kind of helped me rediscover my faith because he like learned to appreciate Christianity from a more secular like point of view. I think of that now retroactively. Like I think what Peterson represents is not just a response to young male angst, but exactly this epoch you're pointing to, which is this almost rediscovery of religion. Like he is an embodiment of that changing geist.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I'm here with Cadell Last, who's been on the pod about 2 times now. One of my favorite guests to have on the pod. He always has something interesting to offer. And I still believe to be one of the best educational resources for studying philosophy on the internet, in which there's many bad sources. And I really like to direct my audience of young learners, people studying the game, to go to one of the best teachers in the game, and that is Dr. Cadell Last, head of Philosophy Portal, who's doing a course on Christian atheism, which is going to be the topic of today's podcast. Christian atheism sounds like a very paradoxical notion, and it is a contradictory notion that was popularized by Slavoj Zizek, has its roots in Hegel, And we're going to be talking about this idea. I'm pretty confused as to what it means. I'm very excited to learn. And through that conversation, we're going to discuss broader themes like reason versus revelation, religion and mysticism, philosophy and politics, philosophy versus religion, science versus religion. But without further ado, Cadell, why are you interested in this topic? Why does it even matter? Christian atheist? Like, what is it? What is this? People are probably clicking, being like, what the hell?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, for me, I came into this term first reading Zizek and him making this distinction saying atheism, but not the Dawkins type of atheism. So I grew up an atheist. I grew up secular, and I think I want to make that clear is like my background, and I think background does matter here, is that I was not raised religious, and Philosophy Portal is not a religious platform. It's a philosophical platform. So I'm going to be teaching this from a secular point of view. I'm going to be teaching this from an atheistic point of view, and I'm going to be teaching it from a philosophical point of view. But at the same time, I think that the term Christian atheism is really important for our culture. Let me just sort of give a reference to what we see in popular media. Just last week on Piers Morgan, on the one hand, he had Stephen Meyer, a famous intelligent designer, on the program to talk about theism. And then the next week, he had Richard Dawkins on the program to come in and talk about atheism. And Piers Morgan was basically falling into this sort of binary trap about Christians versus atheists. And this sort of discourse of Christians versus atheists is the discourse that I grew up in. And it's the discourse that I think has dominated our intellectual conversation for a long time now. And I think that when I was in my 20s, atheism had the upper hand. And I think today, Christianity is making a bit of a revival. And now there's a big Christian sort of intellectual movement coming online. And I think that the concept of Christian atheism is important is because I think we have to stay with the contradiction between these two terms, as opposed to just staying within the binary of one or the other. These binary conversations often end up going in circles and basically leave you in a sort of one-sidedness of the debate. And it's more difficult to stay and hold the contradiction between these two terms. But I think not only Slavoj Zizek, but what I'm going to argue in the course is that the entire history of modern philosophy is a type of Christian atheist project that is incredibly generative for thinking, not only in figures like Kant and Schelling and Hegel, but also for figures like Marx and Nietzsche and Freud and Lacan and Zizek and also one of my collaborators now, Peter Rollins. We're thinking with the concept of Christian atheism and thinking with this contradictory concept as opposed to settling in one sort of one-sided worldview is incredibly productive for thought. And just before stopping there, I just want to say, well, what is that contradiction? And how is that contradiction possible? On the one hand, on the Christian side, you basically have a Trinitarian concept of God. And here I'm just going to boil it down to its very simplest essence, is that Christianity is unique, not only for its monotheism, but for its Trinitarianism. So, of course, Islam and Judaism have a monotheist concept of God. And then there are other religions that either have a more polytheistic conception or have basically an atheist conception. A religion like Buddhism is often conceived of as more of an atheist spirituality than a polytheism or a monotheism. The distinction that Christianity makes unique is the Trinitarian conception. And so going into that. On the other hand, atheism is the inexistence of God. And so holding this specific contradiction between the Trinitarian conception and the inexistence of God conception, but also trying to demonstrate the way in which the Trinitarian conception of God actually offers a unique opening into atheism. And that holding this contradiction matters, meaning holding the position of monotheism, working through it in the Trinity before opening up into atheism, offers something important on the level of our subjective experience and our subjective engagement in the world, which I think is a kind of unique spiritual, ethical, even political or theopolitical stance. So that's what we're going to go into, and that's what the course is going to explore. And again, through the resources of modern philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of angles in which we could tackle this big subject, but I will say why I find this very interesting. And this is I'm sort of preparing myself for my next arc, which is studying the world of religions and thinking them politically, because something I had studied, which opened this door, was the political theological problem, famously posed in those terms by Leo Strauss. But of course, it's not really a new contradiction at all. He just poses it in that way. But I found myself increasingly, as I was studying politics and especially Marxism, I found that the most successful political movements tend to be religious in nature, in the sense that they tend to have a dogmatic component, while even if they're atheist, in the case of Marxism, which opened me to tackle this contradiction, because I feel like if you totally throw out religion and assume a atheist position, you can all too easily forget your own human inclinations towards religious thinking. And it's funny because, like you mentioned also, I also had a new atheist phase. I had a new atheist phase at one point. And it's funny, I went to Catholic school and I was raised a Catholic, but I had a total atheist phase while I was in high school and probably my first few years of university, pretty most of university, honestly. And then kind of only like in the past few years, been reintroduced into religion, more from a like philosophical standpoint, studying its utility. And I think there's something that leftists will acknowledge. Leftists have, I think, a more problematic relationship to religion than people on the right, at least in terms of not wanting to really deal with these contradictions. And many leftists will acknowledge, they'll say, well, I'm for spirituality, but I'm against religion. And I hate this notion, because to me, when someone says they like spirituality or mysticism, but not religion, they're kind of saying that I like the supernatural aspect of religion, but not the rules of religion, or not the community aspect of religion, or not its like practical political function. And I think that is actually what's even more interesting to me than the like whether or not Jesus was really divine. To me, is more interesting is like the actual substance of the religion. So Christian atheism, what is Christian atheism? I'm trying to think of the simplest way to ask this question, because I know that's not going to be easy to answer it.
Sure. I mean, look, it is a difficult concept. It is a contradictory concept. If I could boil it down to its simplest essence, beyond, again, holding this contradiction between the Trinitarian and the inexistence of God, it's specifically this, that and this is made possible this is the argument of Christian atheism. And let me just say, you could make the argument for a religious atheism and say that religions in general open up the possibility of atheism. The argument of Christian atheism is that Christianity has a unique metaphysics that in some way uniquely opens to the possibility of atheism. And then that's sort of supported historically with the fact that the history of Christian societies themselves developed internal to their own societies through critiquing Christianity became humanist, secular, liberal, that Christianity was actually far from being the enemy to those cultural phenomena, humanism, liberalism, secularism, that Christianity was actually the foundation for the condition of possibility of those forms of cultural expression, let's say. So why? How? Like, what's the argument for how Christianity uniquely opens up that possibility? The argument is that Christianity uniquely both centers God as well as centers a God who dies, and then opens up the condition of possibility for an emancipatory human collective or an emancipatory human society. So that is done through, let's say, the narrative of the Trinity. And this is, let's say, in Christian atheist terms, saying that in Islam or in Judaism, there is a transcendent God, but that transcendent God doesn't die. So there's no Trinitarian structure to the monotheist concept. You're just left with a transcendent Father who has a sort of either a mysterious quality to him or has a all-powerful, immortal, or eternal law to him, which can't really be transgressed. Whereas in Christianity, God himself empties himself into his Son, and then that Son who is also God, and this goes into like kind of the contradictions or the paradoxes of the Trinity, which is that God is not the Son is not the Father, the Son is not the Holy Spirit is not God, but somehow that they're all God. It's the three in one God. But this unique sort of Trinitarian structure, this, let's say, eternal paradox or eternal contradiction internal to the Christian metaphysic, opens into itself to the idea that it's not that God doesn't exist, as atheists will claim, and it's not that God is some sort of eternal transcendent deity, as Muslims or Jews would claim, but that an eternal transcendent deity dies into the world and opens up emancipatory possibilities for human social life, human community, and so forth. Does that make sense? Or is there anything you would want me to clarify in that? What I'm really trying to get at there, and this has huge practical ramifications, I think, in North America, perhaps uniquely and specifically, is that there are many humanist, liberal, left-leaning organizations that are incredibly antagonistic to Christianity and see Christianity as the source of one of the social problems in the world, whereas in reality, what I think that motion is doing, which I think is a bit short-sighted, is it's trying to actually kill the Father that was needed in order to birth those very forms of cultural expression.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I understood it just from hearing Zizek talk about it is sort of that, like, Jesus dying on the cross was sort of supposed to mean that God is no longer really here with us. Not that God doesn't exist, but that we're now, like, it's up to humans to go make a world for themselves, a just world for themselves, more or less. Like, I guess that, like, it presents a different view in that I guess this is where the atheist component comes in that there isn't, with this interpretation of Christianity, there isn't like necessarily destiny or a God is up there watching, determining what's happening. But now, like, because Jesus died on the cross, or rather he was allowed to die on the cross, now that, like, it's up to humans to go create that world. But wouldn't this fly in the face of, like, heaven and hell? I think Catholics wouldn't like this very much. Probably not no Christians, but I can kind of see why Calvinists might be more sympathetic to it, because Calvinism is sort of what opened up that space for liberalism, right? I guess that might be a point of clarification to the audience who might not know the history of Christianity and liberalism. But Protestant Reformation, like,
Yes,
pretty much allowed philosophy as we know it to, like, expand rapidly.
Absolutely. So one of the things that's interesting about our world today and about our sort of cultural intellectual climate today, which I think is unique, it's fascinating, and it's a huge challenge for guys like us, is that perhaps for, I don't want to say the first time in history, but it seems like a unique phenomenon in history because of our global world, because of the interconnection of the world, is that the historical distinctions and the denominational splits between different forms of Christianity, we could say here the main distinctions being Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and Protestantism, they're starting to again attract intellectual attention in terms of what these distinctions mean and what their practical, let's say, materialist consequences are. Right. And we could say that for all religions. So, like, if in the future you do a larger analysis of religion and politics, right, I think we do need to do this analysis. What is the political consequences of Buddhism? What are the political consequences of Hinduism, Islam, And then when we now here speaking specifically about Christianity, the different forms of Christianity. And I totally agree with you. And that's actually going to be, well, that is kind of my position, and the position I'm going to be speaking from in the course is that modern philosophy does itself a disservice if it does not recognize that its own condition of possibility was the Protestant Reformation. And that is very important, because what opens up with the Protestant Reformation is the metaphysical belief and ontological commitment and assertion that we can interpret the Bible ourselves, that we can engage in the reading of this text ourselves and make up our own interpretations, as opposed to, for example, it being centered on one sort of religious authority. And so this breaking up of religious authority that happened with the Protestant Reformation, I think actually lends itself to the birth of modern philosophy. And I think that modern philosophers themselves are kind of post-Protestant Protestants in a way. Like, and I think you can read modern philosophy that way. I think when you start to see that, you can read certainly Hegel, I mean, certainly Kant, certainly the German idealists, but also figures like Marx, also figures like Nietzsche, also figures like there are many others, Kierkegaard, who are basically Protestants who are, or they're kind of post-Protestant Protestants in a certain way. And I think that's basically how I'm starting to read modern philosophy, is that modern philosophy is actually giving to us not a new Bible, although the way people might relate to Capital, or the book Capital, or the way people might relate to the phenomenology of spirit might be relating to it in a kind of biblical way, in the sense it's like a really important central text that we're all studying and learning to make collective sense and meaning about our world. But it's sort of more the subjective attitude and disposition to deep readings about fundamental, almost sacred texts that are necessary to build a collective life world together. And I think this is, again, modern philosophy is doing itself a disservice if it doesn't recognize that this whole attitude and disposition is birthed in the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah, what also kind of awoken my interest to studying this in this way and looking at religion as an intrinsically political phenomenon, which should be self-evident, but I think in liberal society we're used to thinking of religion as relegated to individual family households and not as a political phenomenon. And when I think if you're to study movements, you have to look at Islam, you have to look at Christianity, you really have to study these and also their political thought. And Sheldon Wolin, who's a thinker who I've studied a lot, and he's a big theme in my upcoming book. Sheldon Wolin's masterpiece is actually not Democracy Incorporated. It's his book called Politics and Vision, which is a book about the history of political thought. And what's unique about that book is that he includes Calvin and Luther. And he doesn't just go from, he starts with Plato and Aristotle, and he goes all the way up to the moderns. He goes, I think he ends up to modern liberalism. He ends with Rawls. But he starts with Plato. It's like a massive 500-page book. And what I thought was so interesting is he talks about Luther and Calvin. I didn't really thought of them in this political way and how much they really did open up the space for discussion, especially Luther, right? Especially Martin Luther. But thinking in this way, Hegel seems to be doing something very different from the other philosophers, right? Because what I find so strange about Hegel is, unlike Kant, who kind of puts a barrier on what we can know, right? He kind of ends there. There's a certain limit, a hard limit as to what we can know. Can't really go beyond that. And then later on, Nietzsche kind of drifts more to a perspectivism. He doesn't really, I mean, this might seem oversimplified, but like he doesn't really believe in the quest for truth. His whole polemic is against the desire for truth. Like he has this polemic against Socrates, the famous polemic. But Hegel is kind of, in this certain way, like the most committed to like an absolute. And we're used to now today, I guess, I think you look at the way people talk about truth. I think relativism is the dominant ideology. I still believe, like, when people like default on a kind of relativism, like they'll say, well, it's this opinion. And absolutes, people will often say, when you try to posit, they'll be like, that's religious thinking, as like a way to dismiss that. And Hegel is an interesting guy because he's trying to philosophize absolutes. And I think that's why the postmodernists don't like him, because he's all about, they accuse him of the grand narratives. Yeah, I don't know if you like to add to that. So like what Hegel's project is and its relation to Christian atheism, because
Absolutely.
yeah, I think it's like very important part of philosophy.
I think that the way that Peter Rollins and I are starting to theorize it is that Hegel is sort of a unique figure on the level of a figure like Martin Luther, almost saying that if Protestantism was a major historical event internal to Christianity, then perhaps Christian atheists should start to conceive of Hegel in this way. That actually Hegel is opening up a new way to think Christianity internal to Christianity. And there's absolutely no debate about the fact that Hegel was a Christian philosopher. And the reason why Hegel is a unique Christian philosopher is because he's a Christian philosopher who's trying to think and respond to Kant. And trying to think and respond to Kant and precisely the limitation on knowledge that Kant is proposing as an end to dogmatism. And of course, that this is most obvious and most evident in the phenomenology of spirit, where the final culminating chapter of the whole book is called Absolute Knowledge, where basically, in some ways, what he's saying is that the limitation of our knowledge is our very access to the absolute itself. And I think that in regards to what you're saying about the tendency today towards relativism as a dominant mode of thinking, I think this is how we should think about these two axes. On the one hand, we have pre-Kantian thinking, which tends towards forms of absolute dogmatism. And this is what Kant's responding to. And to give Kant his flowers, so to speak, that Kant is responding to a type of dogmatism. And the point of his philosophy is to end dogmatism and to end, let's call it, pre-critical metaphysics. So to say that on the one hand. Now, on the other hand, on the post-Hegelian side, and really in the tradition of philosophy which tries to think as if Hegel didn't exist, we do tend to fall into a type of relativism. And Nietzsche is often seen as the father of postmodernism. I think that Nietzsche is a more complex figure than just reducing him to a relativistic perspectivism, and I think the way in which it's more complex is because of the concept of the overman. The overman, although relative to perspectives, is a sort of singular drive, the overman. And while Nietzsche has a different concept of truth than pre-Kantian philosophers or even Kant, he is trying to think the relationship between the will to power and the will to truth. And what he's against is a will to truth which is repressing, let's say, unconsciously the will to power. So like people who are performing a will to truth, but really what they're up to is the will to power. And Nietzsche wants to demonstrate this hypocrisy, which he sees as evidently displayed in academic institutions and religious institutions and so forth. Now, before coming to like what I'm trying to say here, in regards to your saying that Hegel is the most committed to the absolute, why is Hegel unique? Hegel is trying to think the most monstrous contradiction, which I think is a Christian atheist contradiction, which is the history of the absolute. And he's trying to think absolute historicism. That's what I would call Hegel. If I would say, what is it? It's absolute historicism. It's the coincidence between the absolute and history. That we have to think these together, that we don't just think a relativistic historical process, and we don't just think an absolute which is apart from, separate from, distinct from history and time. And this is classically, and this set up by Plato and Aristotle. Plato and Aristotle set this up as an impossible contradiction, in the sense that you can't think both history and time on the one hand, and the absolute eternity on the other hand, that these things are conceived of as separate. These things are, now in Aristotle, it's the prime mover, right? In Aristotle, there's an unmoved mover, that there's movement, that things move, that's the appearances of being, but there's, as it were, a first cause. There was something that set the ball in motion. In Plato, of course, there's the idea of the perfect ideas, that the perfect ideas, that everything we see, everything that appears is an imperfect copy of a perfect form. And so these ideas, first proposed by Aristotle and Plato, are things that Kant problematizes deeply, because in Kant, what we're thinking about is the very way in which being appears to us. And he's sort of trying to put a limit on these sort of pre-critical metaphysics of thinking about the things in themselves behind appearances or beyond appearances, right? And so this is where the ball starts to get rolling, and this is what Hegel's wrestling with in terms of thinking about the absolute as a historical process. Does that make sense? Is there anything there that's unclear or that needs further clarification?
To me, but thinking about the audience as to what might demystify the concept of Christian atheism as we're building to it, and perhaps maybe reason and revelation being that contradiction. Because I know in your course you deal with Schelling, right, who directly deals with the contradiction between reason and revelation, and that's something that's at play in Hegel's Christian atheism. Which, to clarify, does Hegel actually use this term Christian atheism? Because, or is that just like Zizek using that term to encapsulate something that was in Hegel?
Hegel explicitly, and I would think this should be corrected for the record, that Nietzsche is definitely not the first person to use the term death of God. Probably, if we want to see the origin of the death of God as a concept that's being used explicitly, probably it's Luther. Certainly Hegel also develops that idea, but Luther also has the idea. But Hegel explicitly says death of God theology in his Phenomenology of Spirit. And so he doesn't use necessarily the concept Christian atheism specifically. I'm playing around with the idea that the first person to really develop that concept was a theologian named Thomas Altizer, who I also will be teaching in the course. And Thomas Altizer himself traces it back to both Hegel and William Blake. But the crucial idea is the actual raising. This is what Hegel would say about Luther, that death of God is first in Luther a feeling or a sensitivity. That's what Hegel would say about Luther. What Hegel would say about himself is that he's raising the concept of the death of God to a concept. So he's raising it from a feeling to a thought. And so in that sense, that opens the door. And how powerful these ideas are, I think it gets lost on us maybe because we are in the wake of these ideas now for centuries.
Yeah, so what does that mean, the death of God, to the layperson?
So this is what I wanted to also develop with you. Let's put it in language that both of us will know very well from our psychoanalytic interests and investigations. When we're talking about the death of God, and in the course, I'm going to frame actually Kant as the first person who starts to develop a philosophy that is inspired by the idea of death of God, even if it doesn't say it explicitly. Because what's going on with the death of God is basically the death of the big other. And we'll know that. So like Zizek will constantly say, there is no big other, there is no big other, meaning there is no absolute point of reference for the guarantee of the consistency of our knowledge and guarantee or a transcendental guarantee of being. So what dies is precisely the notion of a big other. And then the idea would be that various religions, including Christianity, including the monotheist traditions, including forms like Hinduism, have some sort of figure of the big other in the background, which is some sort of notion of a substantial unified being that in some sense is the ground for unreflective dogmatic presupposition. So what opens up with death of God theology is ranging implications for other fields of knowledge. In contemporary physics, it's called background dependence or background independence. So for example, in Newtonian physics, what would be the absolute background? It would be absolute space and time. So in Newtonian physics, absolute space and time would be the big other. And Kant is responding to this big other explicitly by saying that this big other is actually not external to us, but actually the categories of our mind. So in other words, what Newton's calling external space and time are actually internal categories of our mind, the way in which reality appears to us, the way in which reality is structured by transcendental categories of our mind. So in that way, Kant is sort of killing the big other, doing a type of killing of the big other, and is opening up, in Christian atheist terms, this movement from God to Christ. Because when we move from God to Christ, what we're doing there is we are actually thinking about the absolute as a historical, particular subjectivity. Like God is a mortal human walking among us, existing in a contingent place and time. And also, before closing, that when the human mind, let's say the human mind has a spontaneous, transcendental tendency to create and relate to a big other, maybe it's because of our birth, right? I've been talking about this recently with some theologians. Maybe we have the need to create a big other because we're born in such an impotent condition, right? And that we're structurally predisposed to creating a big other. So it's not like, and this is the crucial thing, it's not like we can get out of this, right? Like and this is the thing, as long as we continue to appear in this universe in the way we appear in this universe, meaning are born through this weird process of sexual difference and pregnancy, and then born into an impotent body and need to be raised for a number of years into maturation. As long as this is the way we appear here, we're probably going to need to both relate to some figure of the big other and overcome it. Right? So this is why Christian atheism is an interesting term, because it recognizes the need for a big other on the one hand, and it recognizes the need to overcome it. Right? So like in some way, Richard Dawkins, who's an evolutionary thinker, right? In some ways, Richard Dawkins, in like just saying, let's get rid of the big other, in a way, like let's just get rid of God, in a way, he's not really thinking about and this is the crucial thing, he's pre-Kantian in a way, and he falls into this pre-Kantian, pre-critical metaphysics with the evolutionary worldview by not really taking into consideration the way in which reality appears to human beings and the emotional vicissitudes that we go through in our maturation process, which is certainly something that Hegel's trying to think.
Well, it's interesting you bring up Dawkins, because he kind of had a sort of like a newfound interest in Christianity as of recently.
This is a mistake, though. Can I correct? Because this, like, I do hear people saying this a lot, but I was a huge fan of Richard Dawkins back in the day, and so I wanted to correct this. I have a theory about what's going on with Dawkins. Just say it very quickly. Here's the theory: is Richard Dawkins hasn't changed. It's that society has changed, and now Richard Dawkins sounds different. But he's not. So like if you go back to 2005, I found many interviews and stuff where he says explicitly, I'm a cultural Christian. He's always said that. He's always said he's a cultural Christian. That's never changed. He's interested in the art. He's interested in like sort of the aesthetics, the music. He appreciates the history and so forth. But he doesn't believe in the metaphysical claims. He doesn't believe in the supernatural claims of Christianity.
Right.
And that's been consistent for him.
And what's funny is I used to call myself a Christian atheist as a sort of joke, because that is what I meant by Christian atheist, which is not what you're saying and what Hegel and Zizek are saying by Christian atheist. They're saying something very different. But I'd sometimes say is a meme, because I like a lot of the values of Christianity. And I think a lot of what's in Christianity is a lot closer to like socialism than a lot of what we have now, like a lot of contemporary ideology. And I think it's not just like the spiritual aspect that's important. It's literally like rules that organize society, codes of moral conduct, etc., that are also important. The etymology of religion is religere, to bind. You have rituals that bind people together. That's like almost the more important part than what exactly whether exactly certain myths are factually true or not. But back to the question, something I want to demystify for the audience, because it's easy to forget sometimes that I have a very diverse audience. Some people love the philosophy stuff, and some people are here just for the politics and history, and they're like, this sounds like a bunch of mumbo jumbo to me. There's one term you use which I'm familiar with, but some people might not be, which is the big other, and I think that's crucial. Could the big other just be simply described as that space in which it's a space in our sort of psyche that we insert, like that's what God plays as a role as the big other. It's sort of like something we defer to that's beyond ourselves. Whether it's like, it could be even like what the public thinks or what God thinks or what they think, but it's like this abstraction that is kind of like the big other, is like this space that these different examples might fill. I don't know if you have a better way of describing it.
The simplest way I've found to describe the big other is that it's the point of it's where we situate the guarantee of knowledge. And if we lose, something where we situate the guarantee of knowledge, and this is like, there's many practical examples of this, right? Like, so like when I was growing up, I would always get into like debates with Christians about like, what is the axiom upon which if you remove that, then your worldview would fall apart. And that's kind of like the place of the big other. Like, for example, one of my debate partners when I was young would say, it's like, if Christ didn't rise from the dead, right? Like, if Christ didn't rise from the dead, then my whole worldview will fall apart. So it's kind of like this figure of the big other that basically, so like his big other is that there is immortality, right? Like there is immortality, and I know that, and that's the guarantee of all the rest of my knowledge. Right? Like for physics, right? And this is why like Einstein was so revolutionary. What is the physics big other for classical physics? It's absolute space and time. The absolute space and time is the notion that contains all the rest of the knowledge. All of the matter and motion is described within the coordinates of space and time. And Einstein was so radical because he changed the conditions of that big other. Right? By saying it's space and time together. And so the big other, so if you like, and this is like the thing is that, and I don't know if this is true for Marxists or for communists or what your experience is with this, but the way I've thought about it, and you tell me if I'm wrong on this, because this is the way I've written about it or the way I've articulated it, is that communists could come to treat the big other as the world communist politico totality, and that's a weird big other, because it's the weird big other is the necessity and the imminence of the world communist state. That the world communist state is the guarantee of knowledge, and then that knowledge gets transferred into a figure like Lenin, or a figure like Stalin, or a figure like Mao, because they are the guarantors of the world communist politicos.
You kind of read my mind there, because I was going to bring up Marx as an example of the other, but I think it's actually Marx himself that is the big other for Marxists. Because what I find interesting is that even from the least rational, most fanatic Marxists, all the way up to the most rational and nuanced Marxists, this is for people who describe themselves as explicit political Marxists, they always refer to Marx. Like, regardless of what their argument is, they have to say that Marx said it so, or that he would have agreed. Like, even I found it interesting because I know like very nuanced Marxists who will critique notions of Marxism, but they'll say, well, like Marx believed this too, but it wasn't always clear. They always have to defer to this higher like guarantor of their knowledge, right? They have to somehow say that, well, what I'm saying, it's backed up by this big thing. And
so
yeah,
wouldn't even like a truer big other for Marxism, wouldn't it be kind of world communist? Because then you would
that would be a better one.
Because then you would historicize Marx, because Marx is dead. Marx hasn't been alive for centuries, and world communism's still not here. But that's still the orientation. That's the historical necessity.
Yeah, well, it'd certainly be more broader and allow for more context, because if you treat Marx as like a product, within a historical context. Like if you look at the manifesto in this way as simply a pamphlet that's largely responding to the revolutionary climate of his time, and that shouldn't be taken as like a biblical scripture, then yeah, it would be a better way to like, I guess, a better, trying to think of a way to pendulum to like judge knowledge. Because the problem is when we look at the texts themselves divorced of historical context as the guarantor of knowledge, as the big other, then you just get into this classic game, which is akin to Christians debating their different political doctrines and saying, well, no, Christ said this and Christ said that. And there's something awfully antithetical to philosophy to this, but I can't help but notice that almost throughout the history of politics and to a large extent philosophy, ideas tend to develop this way. Like people develop what are heretical ideas through positioning them as if they are kind of already situated within this pre-existing orthodoxy by appealing to a big other, right? Like I find it's interesting, Spinoza is often considered like a radical, like atheist for his time. One of the figures of a
This is super
radical
interesting.
enlightenment, but Spinoza appeals all the time to Jesus.
Super interesting.
Yeah,
That Spinoza is seen as an but that's true. Like that's true. Like but this is how radical these ideas are. Is that like we today most people go to Spinoza for some sort of understanding of God. Like we could see God as nature. But in Spinoza's time, he was seen as totally atheistic in his thinking. So I like that's what I've always thought is like the more like to me, the new ideas are always coming out of people who are on the atheistic side of thinking and people who are more on the, let's say, the transcendental horizon, the God, some figure of the big other. That's more where knowledge is being conserved in relationship to a figure of the big other. But that's not where new knowledge is going to come from. New knowledge is going to come from basically the atheist. Who's existing in some sort of radical state of uncertainty because he doesn't have that figure to orient to hold on to. And I think that like one thing I wanted to think in relationship to the way you were thinking about the way some Marxists treat Marx, Zizek in Christian Atheism says that we should not think about Christ as an answer, but as a question. And I think that and a radically singular question, like a question for me, it's not about like, am I interpreting the Bible exactly correctly, but almost like through your own interpretation of Christ, how would Christ see today or how would Christ act today? Right? And just as like almost like a monstrous speculative thought experiment to live with and wrestle with for your own action and your own relations in life. And I think that's how we should also treat figures like Hegel or figures like Marx. Not to be, as it were, biblically doctrinal with these texts like Phenomenology of Spirit or Das Kapital, but ask ourselves, like, think about Hegel and Marx as a question, like, how would Hegel see today? How would Marx see today? Right? And I think that when you are willing to, and like, that's a really crazy way to live, to take these figures and tarry with their texts, sure. But it's not about being like traditional academics that are like, I've been reading a whole bunch of academic texts to prepare for the Christian Atheist course. And there's all these like little academic disputes and debates like in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, like about what all these scholars are saying. These become forgotten by history. Like it's not really the scholarly nitpicking about this distinction or that distinction, but more about cultivating a way of being and a way of thinking now that is confronting the issues and the problems of our day. And that's a radically atheist way to be, I think.
Well, you know, when I hear stuff like that, I think, I love that. But to what extent is this applicable on a larger scale, right? And this is where I find the contradiction between philosophy and politics. I could say mass politics, but I think that's a tautology. Like mass politics is just mass politics. And religion is more similar in this regard, in my view, to politics than philosophy, even though religion when read allegorically is philosophy in a sense. But I mean, as a function, it's more similar to politics in terms of what it serves. And it, like, having a sort of atheist reading of Christianity, I think someone might argue that would sort of destroy the purpose of Christianity or of religion, because for a large subset of people, perhaps you need that dogmatic sort of guarantee of knowledge to function psychologically in the world. And I think it's not even a matter of intelligence necessarily. It could be a matter of all kind of different reasons. Like, it could be that it's like Nietzsche said, if you stare too long at the abyss will look back at you. Well, for some people, just a small look in the abyss could send them all the way down the rabbit hole and into insanity. It depends on one's mental stability, right? And I think there's something about the idea of like noble lies. And this is where I'll maybe bring in Leo Strauss a bit, because I think Leo Strauss presents almost if I understand it correctly, it could be backwards, but if I understand the Hegelian point of view correctly, that is. But Strauss, I think, positions almost the opposite view on like the atheist reading of religion. But basically, he sort of has like this atheistic view of the universe himself. Again, he thinks philosophers should, and they should study but he thinks religion as like a noble lie is necessary. And this is actually what he likes about Judaism and Islam as opposed to Christianity, because he thinks that Judaism and Islam don't make a distinction between reason and revelation, unlike you could say post-Augustine Christianity, in which, or especially post-Luther Christianity, in which that space is opened up to kind of differentiate reason and revelation a little more. Basically the code of law in this world, in the world for Muslims and Christians, is tied to that higher biblical code. So because of that, this deters philosophy. And it's why Spinoza said Judaism is actually the most hostile religion to philosophy. He didn't say that as like an anti-Jew polemic, but as that kind of more observation. And Strauss is a Jew, right? He makes this observation too. And what I'm getting at with this is he does this, it might seem like he's dissing these religions, but he's actually praising them because he thinks that what this allowed for is philosophers to write in a certain code that only philosophers could read. And he thinks that the problem with opening up philosophy in too much, which by separating reason and revelation, you kind of allow that by essentially you allow for like philosophy that is disseminatable to the mass and watered down and blends in what is a description of the world with a description of what it should be. Because religion is kind of a ought, more like it's an ideal, as opposed to the like raw scientific observation of the universe. He thinks that the problem, I'm not saying I agree per se, but it's an interesting perspective. Strauss thinks that modern philosophers, they dissolve the distinction between the real and ideal by trying to take a solely reason approach to describing the universe. They actually ended up creating an ideology that blended in like what they wanted the world to be like and an observation of what it is, and thus diluting philosophy. I don't that might be a terrible way to explain that, but
no, this is great for thinking.
It seems like I'm trying to position Strauss as almost like the opposite of the argument you're making.
So
perhaps,
this is great.
I understand.
Well, this is great for thinking.
Yeah.
This is super important for thinking. Let me first say that I don't want to propose, I don't want to hold, or I don't want to give off the vibe, or I don't want any way to be misconstrued as thinking that philosophy is the only way, philosophy is the only distinction that matters, philosophy is the only position that is above all the other positions. Now this course is philosophical, right? And my work is philosophical. But and what I'm trying to attract are people who are interested in philosophy. But I'm also interested in collaborating with or networking with people who are more political, or people who are more religious, or people who are more artistic or more scientific, right? So I don't want the philosophy to be the only thing that I don't want philosophy to be the all, right? I want philosophy to have a space, which is a serious space where philosophy can do philosophy. And I want also religion to have that space, politics to have that space, and then to find what are the relationships between these domains that make the most sense for all of these domains to thrive in their ideal, let's say. But let's go into a little bit what this distinction is provoking. So, because this distinction is super important. So it comes up in Hegel, it comes up in Marx as well. So the contradiction in Hegel is the distinction between philosophy and religion, where philosophy is for the elites, philosophy is the pure thought of thinking itself, philosophy is the concept, philosophy is raising all of the mythological and pre-critical metaphysics to what it really is in terms of a pure concept, and that Hegel basically admits that this is not for everyone, like that this is not like that it's not possible. Now here's the thing: I was thinking about this morning. Is like, not only is it not really possible, but it's also not really desirable for 7 billion people on the planet or 8 billion people on the planet to all become philosophers in the purest sense. Nor is that even ontologically possible, because people are living at different ages, people are living at different time periods and cultural contexts. So it's philosophy does have a dimension to it which seems more exclusive. And even on this idea of the Enlightenment, like, and this is the idea that's in my work more and more, and I'm working at this more and more, is that actually Kant and German idealism, let's say, is not I want to make a distinction between the Enlightenment and German idealism. And I don't know the word yet. I don't know the right word yet, but this is important though. That actually, I think Kant is the end of Enlightenment, not the beginning. Kant is the end of a series of Enlightenment figures. But that this is a big problem in our contemporary culture, where scientists specifically, it's like their philosophical training ends with Kant. Right? Like it's as if like they've read their Locke, they've read their Hume, they've read their Leibniz, they've read their Descartes, they've read their Newton, they've read their Kant. But then after Kant, we can just, it's like the whole history of modern philosophy after Kant is like not relevant, like some other weird universe where people are reading Deleuze and we'll leave them to their own devices. Like, who knows really what the relevance of all that stuff is for our science. So I think this is a huge problem, though, that like actually what opens up after Kant is actually the breaking of Enlightenment, and specifically with the rational antinomies that appear in Kant, that this is something which Enlightenment thinkers didn't really grapple with on the level that post-Kantian thinkers did. But I don't want to get too much lost. I want to stay on the thread of your problem, is that for Hegel, so this is Hegel's solution to it. He thinks that we do need a society that has Christianity for the masses. It's kind of like a Platonic solution in some sense, because people say like Christianity is Plato for the masses, right? Like you have Plato, you have a few like theologians and philosophers who spend their life reading Plato and Aristotle and the greatest philosophical thinkers. And then you have Christianity, which is for the masses. And Hegel comes up with a similar solution in the sense that for the masses, we should still have some sort of Christian framework for social binding, but also we need to have kind of more rarefied circles which are dedicated to philosophy of the concept, which are raising all of these myths to, like, again, let's say the purity of the concept. However, it's interesting that it seems to me, and tell me if I'm wrong here, it seems to me like if the split here between the masses and the philosophers is appearing in Hegel, that for Marx, this problem appears as a split between philosophy and politics. That he would say that the philosophy, okay, is for this rarefied group. And of course, he disliked immensely philosophers who are working in academic elite sort of institutions, apart from the suffering of the masses and apart from like the toil of laborers and the proletariat class, kind of living a more bourgeois style of existence. And he's trying to translate all of this philosophy directly into, okay, well, what are the consequences for political history? What are the consequences for labor movements? What are the consequences for the day-to-day life of our work life and so forth? So for Marx, he probably, this would be my presupposition, that he would see Hegel's solution of having Christianity for the masses and philosophy for the few who want to be initiated into that process as a false solution for world history, because we need to have a workers' revolution. And in that sense, I think Marx's ideas start to radicalize, secularize, and turn into atheist concepts, previous notions of, for example, the Christian community, where the Christian community becomes proletarianized, where the Christian community becomes more framed in political economic terms of alienation, as opposed to, let's say, alienation from God, or supernatural terms, alienated from heaven or something. But this distinction between the ought and the is also super crucial, where philosophy does tend towards more the, and this is, I'll stop now. The philosophy tends towards the is side.
No, go off. Like this is actually, I want to hear more about that.
But philosophy tends towards the is side, for sure. Like, and for Hegel, like a philosopher is supposed to not be confusing the ideal and the real, but rather sort of, and not imposing his ideal on the real, for certainly not, like, but more like sort of saying like, this is what is right now, and sort of like a almost like a patient. I think Hegel as a thinker is like, I think if you study the implicit text of Hegel, what you're getting there is like patience, like patient thinking about what is, instead of imposing your idea on the whole world. Whereas religion and politics are much more about ought, like what ought to be. And this is where like religion has a weird relationship to politics, and as you already pointed out, where politics can have an unconscious sort of religiosity to it. And this is super interesting in the modern world, and super interesting in not only liberal context, but also in 20th century communist context, where communist figures can potentially be read as quasi-religious type figures. But there's much more of an ought, and there's much less patience for what is, because what you're telling me to have patience when these are our working conditions, or you're telling me to have patience when this is the world I'm born into.
The point you mentioned about Marx versus Hegel, I think touched on something interesting, which is that I think it's pretty obvious that Marx does not believe that you should have like a section of the mass pacified versus a small subset where the highest pursuits of humanity to some extent are reserved for a privileged minority. Like, I think in many ways Marx's project is essentially enlightenment for the whole people. Like, that's what his idea of communism is, and probably the best text that is an example of that's the 44 manuscripts, which is an interesting text to look at because it's one of the first ones he published. He was like, I think he was like my age when he published it, which is nuts. And it's funny because he starts with like a kind of, it is clear he has a politics. Anyone who wants to say Marxism is purely like objective, skeletal, and divorced from norms. I mean, he starts off, his first main text, the 1844 manuscript, is a extremely prescriptive text because he's looking at how people are turned into machines and how people are essentially deprived of their humanity, their basic, what does he call it? The species being, right? You know, that's like the fourth form of alienation. We're deprived of our species being. And then on the Jewish question is where he's this most atheist, right? Where he's like beam of the people and all that. But it's also, in that, which people forget, is that they need it because like of the pain that is caused by exploitation, domination, capitalism, etc. So he kind of thinks that this will resolve itself. This need for religion will resolve itself in a like post-scarcity communist world. And that I think is a presupposition. I'm not even sure if that's necessarily true. Like, as you said earlier, will we still need something to occupy the big other? And I see it with communists, even the ones who are well off, you have something like,
Absolutely. I'm totally with you on that. I'm totally with you on that. I was
But-
also reading about this. I was also reading about this just yesterday on the distinction between Marx's 1844 work and the work that appears like 5 or 6 years later. And apparently there's a big distinction in the Marxist literature between, let's say, like the more humanist Marx and the more Marx of like cold analysis of capital. And like how to deal, like I was reading Robert C. Tucker's book about Karl Marx and myth. I don't know if Robert C. Tucker's work, but
that's right up my alley.
I think it's a great book. I'm going to be teaching part of it in the course, but like Robert C. Tucker on Marx was like my first like deep introduction to the relationship between Marx and Hegel. And he talks about like there's two forms of Marxism. One Marxism that's more appealing to like existentialists and even religious people who are more interested in like the humanist dimension of the alienation of our species being. And then there's the more, let's say, political economy Marx, like the Marx of like the analysis of capital and the way capital works. And so like that we should problematize like what is the meaning of these quote unquote two Marxes for Tucker. He says that the Marx of the 1844 manuscripts is much more using Hegel's phenomenology as a model, right? So like he's using the phenomenology of spirit, the structure of it, to think through alienation of our species being, and then in his later works becomes much more sort of a cold analysis of capital and so forth.
Mm-hmm. And I guess to bring Leo Strauss into that, which is a way of really bringing Christian atheism back into that, is so Strauss is kind of like the anti-Marx, if you will. Like what makes Strauss a conservative thinker is that he kind of thinks that there are just fundamental divisions in human consciousness, right? And like he thinks that only some people are capable of philosophy. And he has, if you want to know Strauss's political views, I think actually it's not even his big text. It's this essay called On Liberal Education, where he says why, despite not being a Democrat, why he's not opposed to liberal democracy. And he cites Jefferson saying that the goal should be to create a democratic aristocracy, where you can have all the people who could have been Aristotles could potentially become one. Now, where I would critique Strauss is that I think that's pretty much impossible in a society of stratified class relations. And what the founding fathers wanted to create with a democratic aristocracy, I mean, clearly has not led to that. You look at the way rich people behave, and the best and brightest aren't always, they do not always produce the best and brightest. Let's just say that. And you don't, I think this is obvious to anyone at this point. That's like the concept of decay or degeneracy, etc., right? But the reason why I still think I bring Strauss into this equation and Hegel's Christian atheism, its relation to it there is because one can tackle religion as a philosopher from a philosophical point of view, right? But for political change to reach a mass amount of people, we have to deal with people the way they are, not people post-emancipation. And so that inevitably means kind of appealing to some big other, whether that be a patriotism, whether that be a Marx, whether that be a national kind of culture, Christianity, Jesus, like there's all kind of, some people appeal to something. You kind of have to make what is new seem familiar. And I always struggle, like, how do I deal with this? Because I feel like what I'm doing with this channel is a little bit in between two worlds, so to speak. Like, I'm kind of in your world and like Theory Underground's world, which I would say is the teachers, like the people who are doing philosophy, who are trying to better, fewer but better, right? Trying to like have critical thinkers who aren't dogmatic. And I also am friends with a lot of people who reach like these big audiences who spread like socialist or whatever content. And I've been trying to wrestle, like, how do I do both things? It's almost impossible. And I've kind of made it at this point, like on the podcast at this point, is more closer to like the philosophy. But it's difficult because I see people who try to do both and they really blur the lines. Like, I don't know how familiar you are with the platypus people, the people at Platypus Affiliated Society, like Chris Catrone, James Vaughn.
Absolutely. But I know Chris Catrone and friends with a few people who have worked with Platypus.
Yeah, I've had both of them on the show and I've been in dialogue with them. And they're interesting to me because I still think that they are trying to create like they're trying to create a new big other for Marxism that isn't Marx. While they themselves do appeal to Marx as the big other, because they position like their version and they say, well, Marx said that, Marx said this. But their like way to like make Marxism accessible to the public is by appealing to the legacy of the American Revolution and like bourgeois revolutions more broadly to make it more palatable to Western audiences. And in doing so, they kind of romanticize the American Revolution. So I kind of admire their feat, what they're trying to do. But I do see it as like a kind of grand narrative that does sometimes obfuscate the contradictions of the American Revolution. And I point blank ask Chris Catrone if he's positioning a Sorelian myth. And he's like, no, I really believe that. I really believe that this is like Marx's view in the American Revolution. This is kind of its legacy, etc. And I don't know if this makes sense is what I'm saying, but what I'm trying to get to is like using philosophy and as a way to retroactively understand history to create a politics for the present. And in doing so, we have this contradiction between the philosophy part, which is all about questioning. It's all about interrogation. And the politics part, which is all about answers. We need answers now. It's the contradiction I keep facing all the time.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
But I think you're in good company. And I think that, and what I mean by I think you're in good company, and raising this contradiction to the level of your self-reflective moment is I think something that, I don't know if Hegel did it. I don't think Marx did it. Like, basically what I'm saying is that they usually fall on one side or the other, as opposed to working with the contradiction as such. And that's kind of the challenge that I'm proposing for us here with Christian atheism is that I'm looking for a space which is not so, which I think a priori structures a discursive space, which is ridiculous, where you get these, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, these discussion spaces like between Piers Morgan having a discussion with an intelligent designer on one side and then Richard Dawkins, the atheist, on the other side. And they just go back at it and end endlessly in circles about theism and atheism, because they're understanding. This is the thing, is that to hold a concept like Christian atheism, or to hold a contradiction like this tension between politics and philosophy, it breaks the understanding. The understanding can't deal with the fact that this contradiction is irresolvable. And I think that what it takes to live with that is you have to love it. Like, you have to really love it. You have to really be, and the reason why you have to really love it is because you have to live it. And so if you have, on the one hand, these YouTubers who are just trying to reach a mass audience with their socialist popularization, and then on the other hand, you have some weird theory friends who are like in some obscure intellectual space, like to hold both at the same time and to stay with that. Like, I think, one, you'll give birth to something new, you'll give birth to something interesting, you'll give birth to something different. You won't be able to know what it is in advance. So in the moment, it will be anxiety provoking. In the moment, like probably the moment of your current being is like, am I doing the right thing? Should I pick a side? Should I just more clearly define what I'm doing and stay in my lane, as opposed to wrestling with these two universes, which seem to be impossible to bring together? right? It's brave, right? It's difficult, right? Like it challenges the conventional understanding in a deep way. And so that's in some sense what I'm trying to cultivate, not in everyone, but certainly in the people who are attracted to Philosophy Portal, is I'm trying to cultivate this type of thinking about religion and politics and philosophy and I think the concept of Christian atheism is a great vehicle for that. And I think that it's not trying to, and in that sense, it's not trying to be too one-sided against Christianity or trying to attack Christians or people who have a very dogmatic or a very specific set of beliefs about the big other. And it's also not trying, but it's also trying to create a space where atheists don't have this knee-jerk reaction and presupposition that they can't learn anything from religion. Both of those things are untrue in some deep way. But the question that came up to me when you were talking about Platypus, about romanticizing the American Revolution, is that the right thing to do? I certainly don't want to presuppose that I know what Platypus is doing or the direction they should go. But I do have a deep relationship to how do we keep a true narrative? This is a super pertinent and a question that I wrestle with very deeply. And I should say, I do think that my work is political in a way, and perhaps in a deep way, in a way that maybe I don't know yet. But I'm certainly not a public. My public persona is certainly not explicitly political in that way. So I should say that. But to me, to keep your narrative true, your narrative has to constantly be in touch with what I would call the cracks of being in your life. The cracks of being in your life are first, and the narrative is a response to these cracks of being. And what I say is, like, usually my interpretation is that people have the opposite approach, which is that they use a narrative, they use a self-story to cover over the cracks of being. Like Zizek actually has like this saying that like something like a person's personal story is not true. Like Hitler, he always gives the example of like Hitler could tell you a story that would make you have humanist sympathies towards him. Like if Hitler was telling you about like all of the struggles he had as a kid, or he was telling you about all the tragedies he went through to make you like feel some sympathy for the way he is, the way his. Like, so I think that the point here is that to stay with the cracks of being, but then I don't know how this translates politically. My interpretation would be politically that we would have to have a narrative that speaks to a common crack in being, like a collective crack in being. And of course, I think Marx kind of has that in the sense of the class conflict would be my interpretation. Like the class conflict is the crack in being that the narrative is constantly responding to. I don't know what you think about that, but that's sort of where I'm at with thinking about that.
Like,
I don't like necessarily romanticizing a past event in history and like I know like some people do it with the French Revolution, some people do it with the American Revolution, some people do it with other events in history. I know that there's some sort of social utility to it, and I just don't know how far that extends on the level of universality.
So as I mentioned, I'm still struggling through this contradiction, but tentatively, there's been two ways in which I've been dealing with it, which is one, differentiating my audiences, knowing who I'm speaking to at different points. And the second thing is esoteric and exoteric writing. And that's what I think is the most useful part of Strauss. So, or rather, esoteric and exoteric messages. So I'll say the first thing with the audiences. I've kind of started to position One Dime as like the bigger channel that rakes in like more people. And I start funneling them to One Dime Radio. And I know that the people who aren't really like the types who get a sort of jouissance, an enjoyment from constantly learning and having your presuppositions torn apart, they're not going to be fit for it. But the ones who stay will be for it. So I'm sort of having One Dime Radio for this space of wrestling much more with the uncertainty. even though I do that also in like the videos to a certain extent. Like I think the Cultural Revolution is my most dialectical work, so to speak, in terms of trying to understand the Cultural Revolution through its contradictions as opposed to through a grand narrative. But even then, there's explicit and implicit parts of that which we could talk about. But the idea is like I'm aware that some people have a certain anti-intellectual predisposition where like they're going to hear words they don't understand and they're going to say it's just a bunch of mumbo jumbo, whatever. And like it's intimidating. I rarely talk about stuff like this around a lot of like my friends who aren't into this stuff, because it's like there's nothing more dislikable, I think, than being like people thinking you're like smarter than them. There's something very dislikable about that. That's why intellectuals never make great politicians. Max Weber pointed this out, and like kind of vice versa. The other way around is true as well. But I kind of sort of see it as like, I also want like people on the left to think again. I'm very skeptical of just funneling in people into a political movement that doesn't even know what it is or what it's doing. I think there's so much to work out, so many contradictions to work out. And I sort of see like this sort of thought community we have as that space, like a space like that can help. Because I don't
see it the same way. I see it the same way.
Yeah, so that's sort of what I've been doing, trying to push that.
I think it's needed. I think both is needed, obviously, and that's why like people who are willing. Like, but again, I think I just want to come back to like this is like to do this takes a life of love to do this. And I think the reason why a life of love is because it is difficult. It is going against the pleasure principle, and it is going against some of your basic human inclinations to sort of fit into like a given social group and and there is something painful about not fitting in, right? I constantly have this feeling like I don't fit anywhere. There's nowhere that's my home. I'm constantly in the gap. I'm constantly in the divisions and the splitting and the social life that's unstable, right? And so this is this. So you need love. You need love to be able to keep going on with that. I just want to say very quickly that my introduction to this thinking space was in some way provoked by Zizek inverting that Marxist notion that philosophers have only ever thought the world, but the point is to change the world. And Zizek saying, no, today we need to go back to thinking over action. And in some ways, like this tension between Hegel and Marx, everything is here in some way, and at least in the conversations that probably most interest you and I. This and like Hegel here represents thinking, reflection, staying with what is, being patient to the concept. And Marx probably more represents action, politicos, changing the world, and so forth. And I think that the key here that you found in differentiating your audience, in some way, your solution has found you. Or you have found your solution, or the solution has found you. But this distinction between the exoteric and the esoteric discourse, this is also incredibly powerful. And here I would say, now this is me, I also think it's, of course, incredibly dislikable for intellectuals to constantly, like, intellectuals need to understand context, right? Like, intellectuals need to, like, who are you talking to and when are you, you have to, and intellectuals who are divorced from their context are the most dislikable. So you have to, and for me, like, that's why I do what I do, is I try to cultivate the context in which I can have the intellectual conversations that I need to have, or else I'm going to be thirsty for these conversations, right? So in some ways, that's what the portal is, because the portal is a space I've carved out, which is designed to be a space that's attracted people who want that philosophical space. So they come to that space. And so then I can just, it's for me, then that's just a thought buffet. It's a thought buffet where I don't have to worry about being a dislikable intellectual, because I'm around people who also want that context. But this distinction between esoteric and exoteric discourse, I think, corresponds to the distinction between religion and absolute knowing in Hegel, where, let's say, the exoteric discourse would be the discourse of the understanding. It would be the discourse, like, and here I'm using Hegel's language, like, it would be the discourse of the understanding. It would be the discourse of finite subjectivity. it would be the discourse of basically everyday common life, right? And religion as a mode of social binding, right? And in your context specifically, socialist discourse, right? Like socialist discourse as a binding and as a leftist politicos. But then you have the esoteric discourse. And then you need to cultivate context where that esoteric discourse can also breathe, can also exist on its own, can also do the work necessary. And here's what I would say you do. You go into these esoteric discourse spaces only because out of your love to do so and to push your own understanding. And also you find your outlets in writing and for publishing your own books in spaces like you're doing. And then strategically bring it back into the right context for a more popular, let's say, exoteric discourse, right? And then you go between these two, and they both need each other, but they both need each other as split, and meaning that we here see differentiation as positive, where we don't see the unit like the desire to put them all into one. And I think that's what Hegel's saying about the relationship between religion and philosophy, and in regards to Christian atheism, is that this differentiation is positive. Like, we don't need everyone to be the same thing. We don't need everyone to be Aristotle and so forth. So I don't know. That's sort of, I don't know what you think about that, but
I think what I would mean by esoteric and exoteric would pertain to the writing, especially, and the messaging. Because that's what I found very useful and almost liberating about Strauss, was like this idea that maybe I could make something mass appeal, like on the main channel. Because on here, I would say it's largely like we're just transparently thinking things out loud. That's what I like to do in the podcast. Kind of like a just, yeah, it's thinking, pure thinking. And for the people who love that, for the channel, I'm slowly been trying to do things where I have something that everyone can get out of it. Like you can watch it and get something out of it, but then something else that is a little bit more for careful observers to get what I'm saying. So I would say there's a few videos where I have those esoteric messages, like the one called The Two-Party Simulation, Controlled Opposition, and to some extent the Cultural Revolution one. So like the two-party simulation on the face of it is like a sort of delegitimization of US democracy, a critique, taking down the curtain of legitimacy that upholds the system's authority. The other part of it is actually a critique of the Soviet Union and what we could do better instead. That's the esoteric part. That's implicit also in both the controlled opposition part too, because that is not something you can just say to a big audience, because that way you'd be presupposing that they're already in agreement with you that we need some kind of socialism, and they might not. So I don't want to assume that. But it's also a little hard argument to make. It sounds a little Machiavellian, doesn't it? Like to say, well, we need this structure to maintain this regime in the future. But I think it's worth thinking these through, because I notice Marxists don't think about stuff like legitimacy. How do you legitimize your authority after you're in power? You might say, oh, you don't need some other source of legitimacy, whether it be divine right or democracy, because democracies are like our source of legitimacy. You might say, oh, it's for socialism. Like the idea of Marxist legitimacy is basically striving towards communism. That's the dictatorship of the proletariat's goal. And that just gets redefined.
That's what I was meaning about the big other, by the way. That's the
right,
legitimacy.
And that is
the legitimacy is the striving towards communism.
Yes, exactly. Well, and what else is political legitimacy other than like the big other on a political institutional scale? To a certain extent, and you kind of need that to justify authority. That's the rational kernel that anarchists always understand correctly. Anarchists are
the thing, though. Like I think
anarchists think there's no really legitimate authority, and they're kind of right. But the thing is for their political vision to work, requires everyone to think like how they do. And if any political vision requires everyone to think like they're the thought leaders, it's never going to go anywhere.
Like you have to have the right thought
the right thing. Yeah, exactly.
Right?
If you have
Yeah, exactly. Which
if you
is
have
a
any
terrifying
movement based on
place
that,
to be.
it's never going to work. It's going to be kind of pretty totalitarian in nature, even if it tries to work.
I think that's like, again, bring back Christian atheism, is that like, for me, it's like, just because there's no big other, that doesn't mean the big other doesn't function socially. Like, the big other is in some way necessary. Like, it's a necessary transcendental illusion. So like, the way I've thought about it, like I've done sort of social analysis in some of my papers about this, is like, for example, okay, Newton's absolute space and time is a big other, right? It's socially, okay, it's not the absolute ontological truth. It's not. Some of the physicists who did the work throughout the last centuries thought it was the absolute truth. It's not. But it socially functions. Not only does it socially function, but you actually can procure reliable knowledge through this frame. And it's the same for many different big others. It's just and this is why Christian atheism is so important, because you both need the big other, and you need to transgress it, and you need to do it and you need to hold that together at the same time on the level of world history, right? So like, to me, the way I've thought about this, and I actually thought this through with an ex-Christian pastor a few days ago in a podcast I did with an ex-Christian pastor, where he was a mega church pastor. Like he believed. Like, I love talking to ex-Christians who like really believe. That's my favorite conversations to have, because they believed in the big other and now they don't at all anymore. And so they transgress, and so they can see the inside of both. Right? And I think the problem is when we have adults that, my hypothesis is this, like if I was like to propose a social model, a political social model, is like, it would like adults who have like people who, like, if you're having children or if you're in high positions of authority in terms of social life, public institutions of social life, ideally you would have believed in the big other and transgressed it, and you know it's not real anymore, but you still act and relate in such a way to the younger generation that we keep the appearances of the big other. So that's like, and like, to me, this is deeply, deeply human, like deeply species being. So here's how I would think about it. Like for me, I have transgressed the big other in my own life. Like I had figures of the big other in my academic work. I had figures of the big other in my worldview, the way I thought, that I've transgressed now. And now I've radically disillusioned individual or whatever. But if I have children, like I know like my children will relate to me as a big other. Right? And that I should maintain that illusion. Like I shouldn't constantly undermine their illusion. They need that. Right?
It's like the teacher-student relationship too. Like when you kind of do this, that's my critique of like Paulo Freire and like the democratic education, so to speak, is I feel like they tend to dissolve the student-teacher relationship to like almost castrate the teacher in a way where they're no longer effective.
That's where we are ideologically today. When we're ideologically in a space where there's no big other, we castrate the teacher, we castrate the authorities, because we think because there's no big other, then authority and legitimacy are irrelevant. We can just deconstruct it. But I think that's not the right way to go. Like at Philosophy Portal, like I kind of, when I'm teaching, like I think teaching's important. And like I guess, like where does my legitimacy come from? Well, the legitimacy comes from I've done the work. Like I've done the work over the last 10 years. I've done the work over the last 15 years. These things I'm teaching are things I've been thinking about and wrestling with and interfacing with older people than me for 15 years now, more than that. And so the legitimacy comes from there. I'm not actually like the big other in the ontological sense. There is no big other. But at the same time, the illusion of it functions as a vanishing mediator, which has real consequences. And if you don't enact that, society kind of loses its structure. It loses its appearance.
Yeah. I mean, this is like an interesting critique of anarchism in many ways, because
Yeah, I'm not an
anarchists,
anarchist.
there's something about like anarchism. I've wanted to write a paper one day called the infantile rational kernel of anarchism, because there's the ways in which sometimes children are like correct about basic things, like sometimes it'll be children who are more likely to point out that money isn't real than adults, or like that this is a construct, this is just kind of a spook, because they're not like socialized into it yet. And anarchists in this regard, they see everything as a construction, everything as a kind of veil for power. They're essentially correct, but what they miss is like when that veil is kind of necessary, because like when you
They
try
miss
to,
the necessity of illusion. Like,
and it's also, but like it also has it's easy to view it, because it's a construction, as a kind of fundamentally irrational thing. But it also has a rational basis, because you think about why is legitimacy important, not just in politics, but as you mentioned, like when seeking out different teachers. Legitimacy is important because we have time energy constraints. We can't just consume everything. We need to kind of know what's legit and what's not, to pick out what is like worth our time. So like it has a real utility, even if what legitimacy is based on is ultimately a construction, despite being grounded in something, grounded in a truth, I would say. Grounded in a truth.
I think, but then the crucial thing of this absolute historicism angle is that grounded in a truth is something that appears through the historical process. So like when I was saying, for example, that where does my legitimacy come from as a teacher, I gave reference to like my history, and more specifically, the history of my work, right? Like, so I think that like that's where like the absolute and the history coincide. Is like it's grounded in a truth, but that truth doesn't pre-exist me. That truth wasn't guaranteed to me. That truth is something that appears through the history of my work, and then is, of course, relational.
Could it simply be put like this, that for philosophy at its purest is investigation into truth without the guarantee of knowledge? Could that be said? Like without that big other? And because Zizek's whole thing of ideology is right, is ideology is ultimately to obfuscate and cover over contradiction. It's kind of what prevents us from thinking. But because of the role of the big other in ideology, it leaves me with the conclusion that ideology, to a certain extent, is inevitable and necessary in structuring our reality. But to like work, I guess thinking requires thinking through the contradictions of the big other. But it's like a really strange line to toe as to like when someone is really doing that, right? Because if ideology is like kind of necessary in structuring our subjectivity, how do you try to transcend the big other?
So, like when you say, for example, philosophy at its purest is the investigation of truth without the guarantee of knowledge, that's basically structurally identical to what I was saying when I was saying that you're going to find the new knowledge with the more atheist side of the disposition, the existential disposition, because they don't have that guarantee of knowledge. And that the more God side, the transcendental side, is more conserving knowledge, right? And that's why I always think, like, I always give the examples of Darwin, Nietzsche, Marx, and Einstein, all in radically different fields, but they've all produced new knowledge. But if you study their actual history, so again, the absolute historicism angle, if you study their history of their life, you'll see that when they were generating their knowledge, they were in a radically abyssal state. Like it was radically uncertain. Like Darwin was on the boat, like on the Beagle around the world. His dad's like, "What are you doing? Why are you doing this? Why are you in South America collecting shells and looking at animals when you should be studying theology or you should be studying medicine to become a doctor?" Right? Nietzsche's just wandering around nature, just crazy, like philosophizing in a crazy way. He left the university completely. Einstein was working in a patent clerk office, right? Like none of these people had secure relationships to a figure of the big other. So it is, I think, this quote unquote.
And they also
not
had
even-
the oath to be able to do that.
Sorry.
And we could also say that they had the otium to be able to handle themselves without a big other.
This is a huge struggle. So like historically speaking, like guys like Plato and Aristotle, from everything I've learned, is like they were incredibly privileged in terms of their otium and in terms of their life history. I think that as histories progress, there's more and more space for people to fight for their otium, or like more and more people who just have otium given as a condition of their existence. For me, that's been like since I was 25, it's been like this constant fight. Like, how do I stay committed to the truth without guarantee? Like, that's basically, I could frame it like this. How do I stay committed to the truth without guarantee while still surviving in capitalism? And how can I, basically, that's the struggle. Like, basically, and that's like as simply as I could put it. Now, that has come with sacrifices. Those sacrifices are where I'm living, the stability of my income, the stability of my physical location, the stability of my social relationships, all have had to been sacrificed. Also sacrificing starting my own family and all these things, right? Because that requires more and more income and more stability, right? So all of these things are a constant trade-off, right? But then historically speaking, philosophers like are probably the worst for this, but like philosophers are usually seen as like, usually not like the stable, settle down and marry that guy type. It's usually like, that's the crazy guy who can't hold a meaningful relationship type. But no, I don't think we should have to stay with these stereotypes, but like we should at least recognize like these are the trade-offs that people have had to make in their life history to come up with the ideas and the theories and the forms of knowledge that we now take as given. Because we didn't have to work for that truth through our own blood and our own spirit, as it were, our own love for the truth.
You said truth without guarantees, and I really like that.
Yeah.
It reminds me of what my mentor, Assad Haider, in grad school, who I've told you about. Would you have this slogan, politics without guarantees, which is actually a term he gets from Stuart Hall, who is sort of like his intellectual mentor. And I had a disagreement with him on this because I think this is a philosophical, not political mentality. It's only possible as like a philosophy as a way of life without guarantees. But politics is all about guarantees. No? Yeah, I mean, it's like you're going to tell people that you're going to try this new thing and it might completely fail.
Well, that's a weird thing, right? Like, I don't know, like you're the political science expert, but my sort of layman's interpretation of political figures is that they guarantee you things and then they're not held accountable for those guarantees. Like there's a political cycle, at least in democracy. So like there's a political cycle where people are going to tell you what they're going to guarantee you. And then there's the actuality of what they do, which is usually comically different from what they were guaranteeing. And then there's no way to hold people accountable for this difference. Is that off? That's my layman's interpretation.
No, I think that's exactly it, because that is the essence of politics, not just even democracy.
So it's like, it's again this function of the transcendental illusion that doesn't work.
Right. But I think this gets at like a core like conflict between Protestantism, particularly like Lutheranism, Calvinism, and Catholicism, and perhaps Orthodox Christianity. But I know less about Orthodox, so I'm not going to include that. But I was raised Catholic, so I'll juxtapose these two. What's interesting is the arguments Catholics sometimes make against Protestantism, and they don't usually phrase it this way, but what it ultimately boils down, at least from like the intellectual argument for Catholicism over Protestantism, is that essentially Protestantism with the Protestant Reformation paved the way for the undoing of like Christianity, because they see primarily like you need the papacy, you need the priests to guarantee a monopoly on the truth. Or else, when that truth is completely up for contestation, it no longer has that legitimacy, that guarantee of knowledge. That's the way I see what like Catholics argue, sort of against. Well, Protestantism is so different today. The irony, right, is like in many ways, because the Protestant Reformation opened up this space for like the interpretation of the Bible and more secular readings, paving the way for liberalism. It also kind of made up for this. I want to say like undermining of the guarantee of knowledge because they don't believe in the papacy, right? What I see it as the way they make up for that loss of guarantee of knowledge is divine revelation. Because what's interesting is the Protestants are so much more obsessed with like divine, like destiny, essentially, like that God planned this for you, and that's why I think the path from Luther to like evangelicals isn't actually that big of a stretch. Like when you think about it, whereas it like if you look at evangelical Christianity today, it seems like so off compared to even Calvinism or Lutheranism. But I think like how do they make up for that loss of the guarantee of knowledge? And that's this idea like God guaranteed you a destiny, as opposed to like having another guarantee of knowledge, which is you have these practices, and what guarantees the truth of Christianity is essentially like the papacy who are disseminating the truth of God. I don't know, that why it might be this as a speculative take.
Yeah, no, I think that like these are important distinctions to think through. Like as I mentioned, I think we're living in a unique time in the sense that all of these distinctions between Protestantism, Catholicism, and Orthodoxy are once again being raised to the level of reflective contemplation in terms of what are the metaphysical differences between the. I have a friend who's a Catholic who says the great thing about the Pope is that it's like a fixed big other that you can transgress. Like we all listen to we listen to the Pope, but we listen to the Pope just so we can disobey the Pope. Like we know what the right direction is for the Pope, and then we can just transgress it, and like it doesn't matter. It's kind of like the actuality of like what I was talking about the need for a big other just in order to be able to transgress it. And then with Protestantism, it's interesting, but like I have an interesting theory about Protestantism that and this is connected to what I was saying about modern philosophy being kind of like unreflective about its origins in Protestantism itself. That actually what modern day Protestantism today is just what we call secular liberal society. My working hypothesis is that secular liberal society is just the most successful variant of Protestantism. And like the argument here would be like supported with like Hegel's idea that the secrets of the ancient Egyptians were secrets to the ancient Egyptians themselves. I always say like the secrets of liberal democratic subjects were secrets for liberal democratic subjects themselves. So like basically we don't really know what our religion is today. But like this would be like the religion today is liberal democracy, or like the religion is like the way in which we're engaging in liberal secular society today. Like that is our religion already.
That does open up a interesting segue if you have some time for the backroom segment.
Are we stopping the formal now?
Mm-hmm.
Are we closing the formal?
Because we're almost 2 hours in, right?
Yeah,
so
sure.
But I think you gave a perfect segue because I was looking for one. And
okay,
I think that's a perfect segue to religion today. And this would be a continuation of Christian atheism, but also something I've been thinking a lot about, because I do think there's a real utility to religion that I think people are becoming increasingly aware of, that maybe there was something good about it that we do need. But how does this play itself out in pluralistic liberal democracies, especially countries like Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and to a certain extent even Britain, which are much more culturally diverse, right? You can't really in these countries impose, or you can't really, it's not going to be a one solution for all, for sure not. There's going to be, it's probably going to involve many different strings of thought because of the diverse nature of these countries, particularly US and Canada. I mean, these countries are incredibly diverse. So I'm kind of curious about that. Like, how does religion even have a secular revitalization in a liberal democracy that's very diverse, right? So, yeah, we'll get right into it.
The back room. Let's go.
Yeah. Come on, become a patron if you haven't already. What are you doing?
Support one guy.
All the best conversations. Anyhow, we'll see you there and continue this very riveting conversation.
Say Christian atheism starts October 20th.
Absolutely, yes. I'll have that in the description. And if you don't know Cadell already, you're also living under a rock. So, go subscribe to Philosophy Portal. Give it a 5-star rating. Peace out.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.